Before we get to smashing and bashing with Godzilla, I'd like to give a shout out to today's sponsor, Godzilla again, specifically the launch of the new IDW comic book series Godzilla War for Humanity. This tale, which centers around Dr. Yuko Honda's belief that Godzilla and other kaiju, while destructive, aren't necessarily mankind's enemies, is put to the test when a bizarre new creature emerges to threaten the world. War for Humanity comes to us from writer Andrew McLean of Headlopper with art by Jake Smith of Blood Force Trauma. And having read the first issue myself, I can't wait for the next one to be unleashed on newsstands and on digital storefronts nationwide. And if you're like me, and I know I am, the colorful, charming artwork coupled with a classic scenario and intriguing new monster are the exact things I'm looking for in a Godzilla story. So check out the first issue if that's also your jam. And if you'd like to go above and beyond, head on over to inkyknuckles.com to purchase the comic art directly from the source. Without further ado, it's time to enter the Final Wars. Welcome back to another rubber suit wearing and kaiju head tearing episode of What Happened, the show that tirelessly chronicles the video games and movies that sometimes didn't quite hit. And in the history of Japanese tokusatsu or special effects movies, nothing didn't hit quite like Godzilla's 28th cinematic adventure. Its massive budget, bloated storyline, and ill-advised release window has made it one of the more infamous and divisive entries in the legendary monster's 69-year career. Nice. And was also responsible for the longest hiatus in that career as well. So clench your claws and charge up your atomic breath as I answer the question, what happened to Godzilla Final Wars? The Millennium series of Gojira films, which Toho made to hopefully mask the fishy stink of the Roland Emmerich fiasco, which you can learn about right here, didn't bring as much renewed interest in the King of the Monsters as they were anticipating. Many of the movies made during this era failed to match the same box office success that the previous Heisei series had enjoyed throughout much of the 80s and early 90s. Due to this, Shogo Tomiyama, a Toho producer who took over from Tomoyuki Tanaka, the previous and original steward of Godzilla, decided to mix it up by constantly trying out new storylines and continuities to some inconsistent results. Despite the positive reception to the second entry in the Kiryu saga, Tokyo SOS, it still posted an all-time low for Japanese ticket sales, so a third and final part to the storyline, which was hinted at in a post-credits scene, never materialized. The general sentiment at Toho was that audiences had grown tired of Godzilla. Ugh, Philistines! But to be fair, by 2003, there had been 12, counting the Emmerich version, films in 15 years. So yeah, I ain't gonna lie, but that's too much of a good thing. Tomiyama realized, however, that the 50th anniversary of the franchise was fast approaching, and if they were going to let the Big G take another hibernation period, he should at least go out with an appropriate bang, or explosion, or lots of explosions. So the architect of the Kiryu saga, Masaki Tezuka, was bid so long and good luck, with Toho beginning their own search for a new director who could bring something new and fresh to the series. Ryuhei Kitamura, the legendary action director behind the seminal zombie samurai actioner Versus, had just wrapped on Azumi, his first major studio film, which also just so happened to be for Toho Pictures. There were rumors that Shusuke Kaneko, the director of the well-received Gamera trilogy, as well as 2001's Giant Monsters All-Out Attack, was approached by Toho to direct this new project first, but I couldn't find much to back that up. Ironically, Kaneko's next film wound up being the sequel to Azumi, Azumi 2: Death or Love, so both directors were kind of following in each other's footsteps. In an interview with Vantage, Kitamura broke down how this all came about. The producer, Shogo Tomiyama, wanted to meet me. We met, and at the very first meeting, he said, "Are you interested in getting in the Godzilla ring?" So I was like, oh, wow, are you serious? Throw me into the Godzilla ring? If you're a Japanese filmmaker, that's an honor. Tomiyama, in a public statement, said, "We have done all we can to showcase Godzilla, including using computer graphics technology." Did you though? and yet we haven't attracted new fans. So we will make the 50th anniversary film something special, a best of the best, and then end it for now. The first order of business was the script, and somewhat predictably, Toho rejected all of Kitamura's initial story ideas. So instead, they tasked Millennium Series writing regular Wataru Mimura to kick things off, but Tomiyama also inserted himself into the writing process as well. I guess since this was going to be the last Godzilla movie for a while, he wanted to get all of his weird shit in there. This initial draft reportedly played it fairly safe, sharing a lot of similarities with the alien-heavy plots of the late 60s, but Kitamura, a director of excess, wasn't entirely satisfied with it. He felt if this is going to be a big send-off, it needed more characters, more locations, and way more kaiju, which is certainly something Final Wars would wind up having, much to its detriment. As we'll see throughout the rest of this story, Kitamura decided to bring in an outside collaborator to help him navigate these new radioactive waters. I thought that the script needed some new blood, so I brought in this talented writer who also wrote Azumi, Asayo Kiriyama. I introduced Kiriyama-san to Tomiyama-san, and he hired him. So Kiriyama wrote a new draft. We were going back and forth, and in the end, I think Kiriyama took over the shooting script. One of the key elements both Kitamura and Kiriyama wanted to include was a more international/global feel to the proceedings. They felt this would also give the project a more mainstream appeal, and not cater to just the Godzilla diehards that were accustomed to the same types of plots and stereotypes. As we were developing all the ideas and story and everything, Kiriyama-san wanted to make it big, more international. I agreed, so I said, then why don't we make it much bigger and make the entire planet the battlefield? Tomiyama-san agreed, so naturally we started thinking about an international cast. While an exciting direction to go in, this had the negative effect of drastically increasing the budget, something the traditionally conservative Toho bean counters often shied away from. Final Wars would ultimately come in at a production budget of 1.9 billion yen, or roughly $20 million in 2004, which was pretty girthy when compared to, say, Godzilla 2000 Millennium, which had cost about half that. Since Toho were willing to open up the coffers, they also wanted a Western star to play the role of one Captain Gordon, a key character that had been significantly fleshed out by both Kiriyama and Kitamura. Unfortunately, all of their initial choice of actors rebuffed said offer, who included, but were not limited to, Jean Reno, who politely said non merci, Christopher Lambert, who apparently never even got back to them, and finally, Don Johnson, whose asking price was apparently so high that Toho didn't bother with further negotiations.
You don't think that these obviously experienced professionals here are going to fall for a ripoff?
Kitamura, who was a big fan of MMA at the time, then suggested Pride legend Don Fry for the part, because while he very clearly had no acting experience, did exhibit the kind of toughness and bravado that Captain Gordon would need to have.
There are two things you don't know about the Earth. One is me, and the other is Godzilla.
As the script was coming together, so did one of my favorite elements to Final Wars' development history, the kaiju selection process. While the writer, director, and producer all had their personal favorites, they found the best way to decide who would make the cut was to get as many action figures from Toho's rich merchandising line, and to then pose/play with all the plastic monsters to see what made for the best visual lineup. One of Kitamura's goals with the film was to break the record for the most kaiju ever seen on screen, since Godzilla would be smoking absolutely all of them. Speaking of the big G-spot, Kitamura also felt that a redesign of the suit was in order, and tasked a number of concept artists to wow him with a fresh new look. Yasushi Nirasawa, for example, produced this startling red and black affair, avec appropriately edgy curved spikes. Not now.
No.
This was meant to invoke a more intimidating aura, but was deemed too radical of a departure for a film meant to celebrate the monster's lengthy career. Pretty interesting though that such a dark, evil design was initially passed on, only for Toho to embrace something fairly similar 12 years later. Anyway, because of Kitamura's close relationship with Hideo Kojima, Metal Gear series character and mechanical designer Yoji Shinkawa was added to the concept art team as well, and submitted a haunting skeletal-like design for Godzilla, which, while visually unique, was again rejected for probably being too visually unique. Fortunately, Shinkawa's work can be seen elsewhere throughout the film, as he designed many of the vehicles, costumes, and armor, which, as you can see here, are Metal Gear as fuck. Ultimately, Kitamura went with a slimmer Goji design that incorporated several elements from previous eras. Gotta love the little cat ears. The Metal Gear connections didn't stop there. Kitamura asked Kojima if he could be introduced to Kyle Cooper, famous for his impressive opening title sequences for various Hollywood films. Cooper was asked if 50 years of Godzilla film history could be shrunk down to a 60-second sequence, and while he delivered on that, Kitamura was forced to then cut that down by another 30 seconds for the sake of the movie's overall runtime, which up until that point was set to be the longest entry the franchise had ever seen, if you discount the Emmerich version, which, yeah, most people do. Kitamura really wanted to put in everything he possibly could. Subplots and elaborate fight scenes between the human characters, nods to the late Showa-era films of the 70s that he had grown up with, alien invasions, the Twin Fairies, Godzilla's dumbass son, and finally, globe-spanning destruction across America, Australia, Paris, and even Antarctica. There was a lot of material that was filmed, but even then, a good amount remained on the cutting room floor. We just threw in a bunch of funny ideas. There was another scene where these crazy punk brothers get eaten by Zilla. That scene was much longer. We wrote, shot, and edited much more of the drama about this crazy punk and his brother. Ah yes, Zilla. While clearly added as a crowd-pleasing scene, Kitamura found it hard to believe that Toho had the all-clear to use the much-maligned monster. Tomiyama-san told me that we could use the Hollywood Godzilla, so I was like, oh, is it okay? We can use it? We are 100% okay. That's the thing that everybody wants to see, Japan versus America, so why don't we do it? I really wish now that I would have made that scene much longer, but again, I had to pick and choose all kinds of things. So I just made the decision that if I cannot do a full round, let's just end it quick so that at least it gets a big laugh.
I knew that tuna head wasn't up to much.
So, as we can see, Final Goji's gills were filled to bursting with tons of references, characters, and action scenes jumping around at a lightning pace and never focusing on just one thing. While it was a nice contrast from the usual glacial pace of, let's be honest, most Godzilla fare, all that footage would prove incredibly arduous to edit, and as we'll see, become a movie that many fans still argue about to this very day. One of the things in Final Wars that many of the Godzilla faithful don't really vibe with is the brevity of all the fights. Well, the kaiju ones at least. Final Goji was designed to be OP as shit, and steamrolled almost all of his opponents in 1 to 2 moves with very little resistance, so Kitamura basically booked him like a giant radioactive Goldberg. It was hard just because it's big, how much screen time and what kind of fight each monster has. I still know that a lot of Japanese fans were complaining about why there was no Jet Jaguar. Hey, I'm complaining about that too. I cannot satisfy everybody's request. Come on guys, Jet Jaguar didn't really fit into the world of Final Wars. He just didn't fit into the story. Yeah, you know what I say to that, Kitamura? But this did illustrate a greater problem. With so much emphasis on slow-mo martial arts fights and motorcycle showdowns, it didn't leave a whole lot of time for, well, anything else. And since so much footage was shot, the editing process was going to be a whopper. That was chaotic, obviously. It was almost like 4 units shooting all over the world. I love every single moment, but again, we wanted to squeeze it into a 2-hour movie, but it was almost impossible. Still, we knew that we could not make this into a 2.5-hour or 3-hour movie. Yes, it is long, but I don't want the audience to feel that the movie is long. Just keep them going, non-stop, and that's what we did. And going non-stop was indeed what they did, especially the VFX department, who only had a scant few months to get all the CGI shots in time for the early December premiere that Toho had set. Final Wars didn't actually premiere in its home country though, but rather in the United States at Grauman's Chinese Theater. There was a big red carpet premiere, Godzilla actually showed up, and was honored with his own star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, so it seemed kinda like a big deal, even though it really wasn't. Sony TriStar still had the rights to distribute Godzilla movies outside Japan, but for some reason didn't actually bother with any sort of theatrical run for North America, despite this glitzy Hollywood event. There were some tie-ins and cross-promotion with Godzilla Save the Earth for the PS2 and Xbox, and a very overt, even by Kojima standards, Easter egg when you speak to Paramedic about her love of movies.
2004 will be Godzilla's 50th birthday.
You think they're still going to be making Godzilla movies then?
Of course! Everybody loves Godzilla.
Fans in the rest of the world were divided on this over-the-top send-up to the late Showa period. Most kaiju had little more than cameos. There was a lot of emphasis placed on the human characters, even in the third act, and the breakneck pace made for a really, let's say, different experience than most were expecting. Ultimately though, to Toho, if the film made bank, then who cares what the fans thought, am I right? So it's funny/depressing that Final Wars very much did not make bank. Quite the opposite, really. It was in fact the worst performing entry in the Millennium series at roughly $12 million, like that's what it made in total, meaning it never even made back its budget in Japanese theaters. When coupled with eventual DVD sales from across the globe and over the subsequent years, the result is a little bit rosier, but still, that's gotta hurt. As I mentioned previously, a contributing factor to this poor box office result was that this was the 12th consecutive film in 15 years, which is definitely erring on the side of oversaturation, but what was probably an even more contributing factor was the actual release date itself. In Japan, Final Wars stomped into theaters on December 4th, 2004, but the mighty stride of the King of the Monsters was halted by the Japanese debut of The Incredibles, which conversely made $46 million. But there was one other animated movie that was dominating Japan in the 2 weeks leading to Godzilla's bow, and that was Howl's Moving Castle. Yes, Toho released Final Wars in the direct wake of a Studio Ghibli film, and it was fucking cash money, making $190 million in just Japan alone. Now, fortunately, it just so happened that Toho were also the ones who distributed Howl, so they made that bag either way, but still, this 1-2 punch of animated juggernauts drove Godzilla back into the sea for his longest hibernation yet. Final Wars also marked the end of suitmation and elaborate miniature sets for the series, so it's rather unfortunate that this era of Japanese filmmaking for the series ended on somewhat of a whimper rather than a roar. Kitamura, for his part, is proud of the film he made, and would go on to have an interesting post-Godzilla career, including a number of Western horror films. Go see Downrange, it's awesome. Final Wars also signaled the end, or just about, of Tomiyama's film-producing career, and to be fair, he had a pretty solid run, being involved with the franchise ever since the start of the Heisei era. Fortunately, and rather obviously, this did not spell the end for the God of Destruction, as 10 years later, through the efforts of the man that made Godzilla fly, Yoshimitsu Banno, the Big G returned to prominence with the legendary version of the character, whose global success then spurred Toho to greenlight a number of new projects, from live action to anime, and now a prequel of sorts with this year's upcoming Godzilla -1. Honestly, we can't be too mad here, because for us kaiju fans, we are getting some action from every possible angle. Just tons and tons of radioactive dongs just slapping us. I'll stop. If you know of any other monster-sized video games or movies that were drop-kicked during their development periods, do let me know in the comments below or hit me up on my Twitter, because that's what it's called. See you next time, and thanks for watching!